Good evening. I'm delighted to be here tonight to welcome you to the second of Asia Society's public lectures with the accompanying the exhibition, The Art of Impermanence, Japanese Works from the John C. Weber Collection and Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III Collection. This presentation of spectacular works ranging from Neolithic period to 20th century is a testament to the strengths of two important collections of objects built by New York's passionate collectors of Japanese people who are passionate about Japan and Japanese art. Although our galleries are closed for safety and for the sake of the public and our staff, our museum team is delighted to bring you the best possible continued coverage so that we can share great art and art programming with you. Please make asiasociety.org/museum your home from home, since our online museum material is accessible to you 24/7. This beautiful exhibition catalog can be ordered from our online store. And once restrictions are lifted, your order will be processed and you'll be notified when it's shipped. We apologize in advance for shipping delays and thank you for your patience and support during this difficult time. Support for the Art of Impermanence, Japanese Works from the John C. Weber Collection and Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller Collection, the third collection comes from the Japan Foundation and an anonymous donor. Support for Asia Society Museum is provided by Asia Society Global Council on Asian Arts and Culture, Asia Society Friends of Asian Art, Arthur Ross Foundation, Cheryl and Charles R. Kay Endowment for Contemporary Art Exhibitions, Hazen Polsky Foundation, Mary Griggs Burke Fund, Mary Livingston Burke and Mary Griggs Burke Foundation, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and New York State Council on the Arts. We are also, of course, deeply indebted to Dr. John Weber for having lent significant works from his collection to present together with objects from the Asia Society's Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III Collection. I'd like to thank our members for their important support. If you're not already a member, please join us so we can continue to enjoy Asian art exhibitions and programs like this one. Our final lecture in this series will continue online with Tattered Fans and Talismans, the Symbolism of Battle Fans and the Ethos of Impermanence by Melissa McCormick, Professor of Japanese Art and Culture at Harvard College. Please check our online, on our website to confirm the date of this lecture. Looking ahead, the importance and vitality of this concept of impermanence has not lost its relevance over time, and in fact, seems to become more and more pronounced in our current time of uncertainty. Asia Society plans to move ahead with its inaugural Asia Society Triennial, We Do Not Dream Alone, later this year. Visit asiasociety.org/triennial and sign up for the newsletter updates. Our colleagues in the world of policy and business have an ongoing array of online programs addressing foreign relations, business, and policy. And for information about all our work here in New York and around the globe, check out wasiasociety.org. So finally, to the format of this program, we will have an approximately 50-minute lecture followed by an opportunity for Q&A with the speaker through our online platforms. After the broadcast, the lecture will be posted within a few days on Asia Society's website in case you've missed any of it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Simon Kaner, who will tonight speak to us on monuments to impermanence, new inspirations from ancient Japanese stone circles and burial mounds. Simon Kainer is Executive Director of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Art and Cultures, as well as Director of the Center for Japanese Studies, University of East Anglia. He's an archaeologist specializing in the prehistory of Japan. Before joining the Sainsbury Institute, he was Senior Archaeologist at Cambridgeshire County Council. A Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London since 2005, he has taught and published on many aspects of East Asian and European archaeology and has undertaken archaeological research in Japan, the UK, and elsewhere. His publications include The Power of Dogu, Ceramic Figures from Ancient Japan, 2009, which accompanied a major exhibition at the British Museum. Other works include Jōmon Reflections, Forager Life and Culture in the Prehistoric Japanese Archipelago by Kobayashi Tatsuo, 2005, which he adapted and edited with Nakamura Oki, as well as an illustrated companion to Japanese Archaeology, 2016. Kainer earned his MA and PhD from Cambridge University. This evening, Dr. Kainer is joining us from Girton College, Cambridge, and we appreciate his being here for us at such a late hour for him. Without further ado, here is Simon Kainer.
Adriana, thank you very much indeed, and good evening or good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, although I have to say it would be an even greater pleasure to be in New York. I've made a few preparations though to make it feel a little more authentic. I have my very own copy of this amazing volume, The Art of Impermanence, that I've enjoyed looking through very much. Fabulous illustrations, and I'm just really gutted that it's not possible to get over there and see this exhibition. But some amazing things in there, and the book does many of these tremendous artworks great service, I think. So congratulations to everybody involved in that. Now, in terms of an audience this evening, I'm accompanied this evening by my wonderful wife, Dr. Liliana Yannick, an archaeologist in her own right, who works extensively on visual archaeology and art archaeology, including working with me in Japan. And we do have a few props, because I thought I didn't want to feel too lonely this evening. So we have one of the great artworks on display in the exhibition, and I think it actually opens up in the book. It's either it's in the first few pages in the Jōmon section, the prehistory section. Where are we? Retrieving Lost Worlds. This wonderful vessel here, what we call a flame pot. Well, we have one, just happen to have one, a close relation just here. I don't know if you can see that. We've been discussing uses for this. These are actually cooking pots, but we think they'd be pretty good for mixing up Manhattans on other occasions. So we might have to return to that later on. We're working, what I'm going to be talking about this evening are some research which is arising from some ongoing projects that we've got, one of which this is a modern take on one of these flame pots. One of these projects is called Art of Jomon, and hopefully, depending on how things go, this will lead to an exhibition of some of this rather extraordinary, wonderful material here in the UK. So as soon as you can get on aeroplanes again, I hope you'll come over and join us for that. Adriana mentioned that a few years ago we did we had a couple of exhibitions on Jōmon period Dogu. So I've got these two characters sitting on my desk, keeping me company this evening. We'll come back to this one at the end of the evening, as I think he's particularly relevant to what's going on in the world at the moment. So without further ado, I thought rather than having to sit and look at me for the next 40 minutes or so, you would prefer to have some pictures. And if I can get this right, we have a PowerPoint, and I think I do that and that, and hopefully in front of you, you have my title slide, which reveals that I'm going to be talking to you about monuments to impermanence. If there's not an oxymoron there, I'm not quite sure what it is, but anyway, we're looking for some new inspirations, if you like, from Japan's ancient stone circles, burial mounds, and indeed early cities, structured, if you will, by this notion of Impermanence. Here's the book that I've already talked about, and as I say, full of wonderful examples. It starts out with an amazing essay by my very dear friend Melinda Takeuchi over in Stanford. I don't know if you're watching this evening, Melinda, but what you wrote about Japanese archaeology and prehistory, as well as the later periods, I think just really brings this topic to life. And I thought I'd better do a little bit of homework myself on the notion of impermanence, and it led me to this gentleman Dogen, the priest Dogen, who was responsible really for setting up the Soto sect of what we now know as Zen Buddhism in Japan. He was alive in the 13th century and is very much associated with one of my favorite places in Japan, which is the Eiheiji Temple in Fukui Prefecture up on the Sea of Japan coast. And it's one of those places, if you haven't been, you really want to go up there. It's an amazing atmosphere, and it is just the place to sit and to meditate, if you like, on these three marks of existence, of which impermanence is just one. The other two, of course, all those Buddhist aficionados out there will know that the other two are suffering and the non-self. Now, I'm no specialist on Buddhist art or archaeology, although I've got a couple of examples that I'll bring up later on. I really work in prehistory, and I don't quite know what Dogen would have made of prehistory, and this notion of a time, if you like, a time before recorded time, a time before people had much of a sense of the passing of time, perhaps. And if impermanence relates to that, maybe it does, then some of the examples I'm going to show you this evening will hopefully steer us through this a little bit. Here again is this wonder. These are actually photographs of the amazing flame pot, which is in Dr. John Webber's own collection. It's been on display at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. I was able to see it myself a few years ago. Fabulous example. You can see on the central shot there, it's a lovely leaf impression on the bottom of that vessel, which in some ways sort of sums up some of these ideas to me, because it's about how through materialization we can capture the impermanence of things, or the impermanence of existence. And what could be more ephemeral or impermanent than a leaf that has fluttered down from a tree maybe 5,500 years ago, and this pot has just entirely by chance has sat on this leaf, and what we're seeing there are the leaf veins impressed in what would have been the leather hard base of that vessel before it was fired in a bonfire by our prehistoric Japanese potters. Just before I turn to the archaeological material, I just want to say a little bit about some of the broader context that I've been thinking about as I've put this talk together over the last week or so. And in particular, thinking about the way in which today we value these very ephemeral traces from the past, that in another universe, we might say, come on, let it go. We should just be celebrating these things as traces of impermanence, if you like. What we've been spending a lot of our time doing these days is protecting these traces, coming up with wonderful frameworks for the protection of them to make sure they can be enjoyed by future generations. And the largest scale protection, if you like, is the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. And interestingly, next year, a series of prehistoric sites that I'm involved in are going to be put forward, hopefully, as Japan's latest World Heritage nomination. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes thinking about this. And I grouped it in terms of the heritage, if you like, of impermanence. And I just did one of those fun things where you come up with a whole series of words and think, what are we trying to do around the heritage of impermanence? And as you can see on the screen now, there are plenty of terms there, but altogether they really, I think they lead up to a number of questions around who are we as people? What is our shared humanity? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And what have we achieved? And what aspects of that shared heritage do we want to preserve or conserve to ensure that future generations can enjoy and benefit from whatever it is, just as we do today? Why is this important? Well, it's in the headlines, really. Over the last 2-3 years, we've seen a number of very highly regarded, well-known sites being damaged or destroyed. Here we've got an example where it's human action deliberately blowing up the temple at Palmyra in Syria. But closer to my Japanese research base, we've had the very shocking example of the destruction by fire of the Shuri Castle. The castle was a reconstruction from the 1950s, admittedly, but it is the castle. This was the home to the Okinawan, the royal family of the Ryukyuan kingdom up until the 1860s. And of course, we're all sort of horrified to see these scenes from Paris, just getting on for a year ago now, 15th of April, when surely one of the most iconic buildings that we've real statement about the permanence of the role that sort of the medieval structures play in our European capital cities, burning, a lot of damage done, and only now in the process of assessment and trying to sort out how this should be reconstructed and what can be saved from that. Now, there's an imbalance in recognizing World Heritage, these sites which are considered to have what is described as outstanding universal value. They have to be of the very greatest significance for humanity as a whole. And this map just sort of shows that imbalance and explains why there's a lot of work going on at the moment through UNESCO and other international agencies to try and get other countries, apart from this big predominant pink blob in the middle that is Europe, to put forward sites for World Heritage status. And I think it would be fair to say that across East Asia, between China, Korea, and Japan, there is a huge interest in World Heritage status and getting the most important sites from these countries recognized in this way. Now, Japan only ratified the Convention on World Heritage in 1992. This is a chart from 2018. Now we're in 2020, so we now have 24 World Heritage sites in Japanese archipelago. Here's a map showing where they are, and my talk today is very much going to focus on two sets of these. One is the Mozu Furuichi mounded tomb cemeteries, and the other sites in the Kansai region, the historic monuments of ancient Nara in particular. But before that, we're going to have a look at the Jōmon sites of northern Japan, right up in the northern end of the main Japanese island of Honshu, in Aomori, in Akita and Iwate prefectures, and the island of Hokkaido. Now, we know that heritage is a very powerful, excuse me, I just want to go back one, is a very powerful asset to humanity. And it's not only things that we might give us a nice rosy glow going to visit cathedrals or archaeological sites or what have you, but there are other sites which remind us of our own maybe predestination to do as much damage as humanity is able to do. And here with the atomic dome, the Genbaku Dome in Hiroshima, we have perhaps the most powerful reminder of that. And the Genbaku Dome was inscribed back in 1996 as being not only a stark and powerful symbol of the most destructive force ever created by humankind, but it also expresses the hope for world peace and the ultimate elimination of all nuclear weapons. And this, to me, says something about impermanence, because there's something that humanity could do with more appreciation of this nature of impermanence, our own impermanent state here, our own temporary inhabitation of the planet. Now, I'm much obliged to our current Handa Jōmon Archaeology Fellow, Professor Uchiyama Junzo, who put together this rather wonderful chart for me, which I think helps us think about temporalities and permanencies, impermanences, if you like. This is his calendar of human history. And what he's done is he's taken the last 200,000 years of human history, and he's converted it into a one-year calendar. And the most, from my perspective, I work on later prehistory and the early historic periods, that if we take that 200,000 years, we're only really considering the last month of the year, December. And you can see here a little chart that sort of shows the Jōmon period that I'm going to be talking about at the beginning of December, the first ceramic vessels being made. I'm going to be talking about Jomon stone circles. They don't appear until after the 22nd of December. So we're well into the last month of this this annual metaphor, if you like, for the whole of human history. And then we're right up on the 31st of December, before rice farming and metallurgy and early state level societies start to appear in Japan. And these are the two periods that I'm going to focus on with my examples in the rest of the talk. Now, I know that many of you are probably very familiar with Japanese prehistory and you'd have seen some of this material before, but I just wanted to set some context for the first set of examples I'm going to give you about Jōmon archaeology. Jōmon period, a great long period in human history, getting on for 13,000 years altogether, from the creation of the first well-dated ceramic containers that we have from pretty much anywhere in the world. There are a couple of other examples from China and the Russian Far East, but the examples that we have from the Japanese, what is now the Japanese archipelago, are really quite remarkable because there's so many of them, and they represent the beginnings of this very long tradition, that's a continuous tradition of ceramic making that goes all the way through from about 15,000 years ago all the way through to about 2,000 years ago. And I'm just going to show you a few examples of these. The Jōmon period, where archaeologists love to divide things up, but what these pots hopefully show you is something of the diversity of these Jōmon pottery forms, and the detail that went into them, the tremendous amount of craftsmanship that formed these vessels, that gave us sort of a tremendous variety of forms, of decorations, all based around this sort of the Jōmon itself, which means cord marked. These are twisted plant fibers that are rolled or impressed on the surface of these pottery vessels when they're still leather hard before they are fired. And these vessels are the ones that are perhaps the most relevant for what I'm going to be saying in just a couple of minutes about Jōmon monuments. And these are vessels from the later part of the Jōmon period, from around about 4,000 years ago through to about 2,000 years ago. And vessels start to become much more sophisticated perhaps than what's happened previously. They're much more standardized. Some of the styles of decoration become much more standardized, much more routinized. And we also find that there's a shift away from just making pots for cooking things in to making pots for serving things in. And it seems that the whole serving and consumption of food becomes a rather ceremonialized or ritualized affair. This is like Jōmon's Sunday best in front of you on the screen right now. Now, these Jōmon peoples of the Japanese archipelago, who were fishers, gatherers, and hunters. They weren't farmers. They didn't grow crops that we know of, or certainly no staple crops in the way, for example, that rice or wheat becomes important in societies later on. But these people are subsisting largely on the natural resources that they can forage and collect from the natural environment around them. And they also had a very rich what we describe as a ritual or spiritual life, it seems, which seem to be materialized through objects such as these, including ceramic figures, ceramic masks, polished stone bars, and they made a whole range of objects that they could take around with them and carry out their ritual activities and beliefs with these. Now, I mentioned that, going back to our World Heritage Sites, if you like, that there is a bid, which hopefully will be going in next year or possibly the following year, for 17 of these prehistoric Jōmon sites, which are currently on Japan's tentative list for World Heritage nomination. This is all going to be put forward to the World Heritage Committee for consideration for inclusion, designation on the inscription on the World Heritage List. And these include 3 stone circles, and it's the stone circle sites I'm going to focus on. But I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what some of the other sites look like. They include settlements, large-scale settlements, such as Sannai Mariama up in Aomori, as we can see here. And you can see there are some very substantial structures on this site. Now, this is a site that was occupied for over 1,500 years altogether, between about 4,500 and about 3,000 BC, and comprises of a very large number of buildings, of dwellings where people were living here, and they were also building wooden structures like this sort of strange towered building here that looks monumental in scale, and they were also building themselves some very large buildings which were perhaps used for various community activities. And interestingly, they were continuously rebuilding these structures. They were very aware, if you like, of the impermanence of the materials that they were using to build. And that's largely wood and soil, turfs, if you like. You can see some of the turfs along the roofs, and reeds and grasses that were used to thatch these structures. We see something very similar here at another of these large Jōmon settlements, a site called Goshono in Iwate Prefecture, a little bit further to the south. So these are village type communities, but one of the biggest questions that the Jōmon archaeologists ask is, were people living in these villages all year round, and were they living there for multiple generations, or were many of these villages seasonal places where people came together and lived together? So there's a sense of, in terms of lifestyle, this impermanence of inhabitation, whether the people were living in one place all year round, or to what extent were they moving around. As we get into the later part of the Jōmon period, in this part of Japan, these large-scale settlements largely disappear. And people, instead of building large settlements for themselves, seem to focus on building large-scale monumental sites for them, which we call stone circles. The Japanese term in katakana is stone sakaru, or kanjo reseki. Kanjo reseki is perhaps a little closer, because that means a circular arrangement of stone features. These are perhaps not stone circles in the sense that we're perhaps familiar with from a UK perspective, and maybe some of you have visited Stonehenge and sites like that, but they are still very substantial structures. Here at the Oyu stone circles, built between 4,200 and 3,700 years ago, so an occupational history for about 500 years in Akita, in Kazunor City, 2 sets of stone circles on these days divided by the road going right through the middle. Where are they? Well, they sit on a terrace raised up above the Oyu River, about 180 meters above sea level, a little bit inland. As you can see from this map, we're right in the middle of the northern bit of the northern island of Honshu here. 2 stone circles, the Manza circle and the Nonakado circle, both around about 45 meters in diameter and about 150 meters apart. There's quite a long and distinguished research history for these sites. They were designated as a National Special Historic Site way back in 1956, and there have been extensive excavations both of the stones themselves and of the surrounding area. And if you visit this rather lovely spot in rural Akita today, as I've done on a number of occasions at different seasons, you can see that it is now presented to the public with some reconstructed buildings to give a sense of this monumentalization of the landscape. Now, the stones to build these stone circles didn't come from immediately next door. As you can see from here, they came from anything up to about 5 kilometers away. Now, these aren't stones, they're not megalithic stones in the sense that Stonehenge stones, which weigh many tons, are megalithic. But even so, these stones, as you can see here, weigh between about 20 and 200 kilos. So that's too heavy for one person to carry. So this is a tremendous group effort to bring these materials together. And what we have here, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, is what we call the sundial stone, which I'll come to in just a second. They're a double set of concentric circles, about 90 meters apart, but there is a connection between them. Some scholars have suggested they're just aggregations of burials, they're cemeteries, their circular shape reflecting the circular shape of some of the Jōmon settlements. But more recently, a number of scholars have suggested that the alignments that we can see between the Manza and Nonakador stone circles suggests an astronomical relevance. And I think this is very important in terms of understanding how Jōmon people might have thought about the passing of time, which takes us back to our theme of impermanence. We know there are a number of features have been discovered all around these two stone circles. We know that we've got a number of burial pits, but there were other ritual activities taking place here as well. We can know what with the kind of materials that people are being buried there with. Unfortunately, the skeletons, because of the very acidic soils of this part of Japan, don't tend to survive very well. But we do have some lipid analysis or some fatty acid analysis from the inside of some of these two grave pits that suggest that there were human remains in there before they disintegrated into the soil, very often buried with arrowheads and ceramic vessels, as we can see here. There were a number of buildings built around these stone circles. So the stone circles then would have always have been visible. They were very much permanent monuments gradually being built up, permanent markers. But the buildings around them seem to have been very temporary affairs. So maybe there was something here. Maybe these were exposure platforms where the dead could have been exposed prior to being interred in the ground. Maybe there were places where some of the materials belonging to the deceased were displayed prior to them being buried in the ground. But again, they're constantly being rebuilt, as you can see from all those yellow squares on the slide here. And that suggests that there is an awareness of the impermanence of these particular structures, contrasting with the permanence, if you like, of the stone monuments themselves. There are a number of smaller stone alignments in different areas around the site, suggesting perhaps there are different groups coming from different areas within the region together, perhaps different seasons to carry out their rituals, including the burial of the dead. And we know that some of the artifacts that come from these smaller circular stone alignments include things like these figurine fragments that we can see here. Archaeologists like to use scientific dating methods to pin down exactly when these things are happening. But of course, we're dealing with prehistory here, and it is tricky to give exact dates here. And Enrico Kramer, one of our colleagues working on Jōmon archaeology, has a lovely concept called temporal uncertainty. And you can see from the chart on the right, the amount of uncertainty that we're having to deal with in terms of trying to really pin down exactly when these places were built and how long they were used for. The next few slides really just make the point that these monuments have a historical sequence all of their own. And I'm just going to take you through this relatively rapidly. You can see an archaeologist, through their excavations and through their dating programs, have been able to demonstrate that there is quite a complicated history here. And one of the interesting questions that I ask about these sites is, to what extent were the people who were using these monuments over this 500-year period, to what extent were they aware of the time depth for which these sites were used? Don't forget, these are hunters, gatherers, and fishers. And ethnographic examples suggest to us that small-scale societies such as that don't have agriculture, don't tend to have a very long time depth. Once your ancestors are 2 or 3 generations back, they enter a kind of a generalized ancestral pool, and the individual nature of those people tends to get forgotten about. I think these are questions that would be very interesting to ask of this site, and again, sort of lead us to this notion of, back to this notion of impermanence in terms of the structuring and the historical consciousness of the lineages that might have come together to create sites like Oyu. And there are other examples of this as well. Here is another Isedotai, a little bit, so about an hour away from Oyu, also in Akita Prefecture, where we have a complicated site with 4 distinct circular settings of stone monuments here, each with historical sequences as complicated as what we're seeing at Oyu. And here they are from above during excavations. I think here you can see very clearly that there's an entranceway that's been marked out, and there are also breaks in those circular arrangements that suggest there are other entranceways in. And here on this plan, you can once again see those temporary buildings being rebuilt, one on top of the other, at Ise Dortai. And we also have some rather wonderful figures, these dogu figurines from that site as well. So it's not only burial that's happening, but there are other types of ritual, ceremonial activities taking place here as well. And my third example, which is the third of the stone circles that are being put forward for inscription as World Heritage status, is at Komakino on the outskirts of Aomori city, very close to that large settlement of Sannai Mariama that we saw before. Now, let's go back to Dogen, and we'll go back to him via this rather wonderful book, which was one of my favorite reads as an undergraduate, which is Marshall Sahlins' Stone Age Economics. And I would recommend it to all of you if you're interested in understanding or thinking about the ways in which fisher, gatherer, hunter, small-scale societies think about time and the passing of time. Sahlins identified this thing called the Zen road to affluence. And he considered, and he quite observed, quite rightly, these people had very limited, small impact on the environment. They didn't have huge material needs, and they had a very different way of being, of inhabiting their landscapes to what we're perhaps used to in the 21st century. Perhaps most interestingly, he worked out how many hours each day these people were spending on what we might describe as productive or subsistence activities. And it was remarkably few, maybe 20 hours a week on average was what was needed, just a few hours a day each day to go and collect the basic foodstuffs that you need, something to mull over perhaps while we're finding all of our assumptions about the availability of foodstuffs from supermarkets in our current restricted circumstances coming into question. We know that Jomon people had a complicated cosmology, a complex set of ideas and beliefs, and there's been a lot of very interesting work done by one of my great supporters, Professor Kobayashi Tatsuo, Kokugakuen University in Tokyo, who I work with very closely, who has ideas about the ways in which Jomon people structured their landscapes and structured them very much in terms of monuments and large settlements and how they related to the movement of cosmological bodies. Now, these objects have become recently, there's a boom in interest in Jomon archaeology at the moment. These objects play an important role in soft power, in cultural diplomacy, as we can see here at the G8 summit in Hokkaido. And right now, we're in the middle of this boom, what's described as a Jomon boom, where people are rediscovering their interest in Jomon. For many years, I think it would be fair to say that most Japanese people had very limited interest in Jomon archaeology, but today it's seen as a way of very alternative, it's seen as a gateway to a very alternative way of inhabiting the Japanese archipelago, one which is a very long way away from the frenetic pace of life in Japan's very hyper-urbanized modern society. And here we see some of the examples of recent publications, exhibitions, wonderful exhibitions that are happening all around Japan. If you're there, there was one on these extraordinary Jomon pots from Yamanashi Prefecture, that wine growing area down in Kyushu, for example, at the end of last year. And there's a lot of work going on in terms of contemporary art and archaeology and the way that contemporary artists in Japan are inspired by the Jomon tradition. All of this perhaps culminated just 2 years ago at the Tokyo National Museum with the first ever major exhibition of Jomon archaeology there, over 350 items on display, including my favorite goggle-eyed figurine and the flame pots, of course. And that exhibition then traveled to Paris as part of the Japonism's 2018 season of Japan activities. Again, seeing Jomon archaeology very much being tied in with the identity of what it means to be Japanese today. Now, I've been talking about Jomon stone circles, which are made of relatively small stones, some of the work that we're doing, and in fact we're hoping to have an exhibition on this later in either this year or into next year, is at perhaps the big brother or the big sister of those Jōmon stone circles. This is Stonehenge down in the south of England, perhaps the most famous archaeological site in Europe, if not one of the most famous anywhere in the world. And Stonehenge, again, an occupational sequence of perhaps 1,000, 1,500 years, very much symbolizing permanence, a permanent presence in the landscape, or did it? Because actually we know there's a long, complicated occupational history to Stonehenge, just as there is to those Jōmon stone circles. And doing some interesting work to look at those relationships is turning out to be really very interesting indeed. He's one of my heroes, William Gowland, a man who spent 16 years living in Japan in the later part of the 19th century, investigating many of the large burial mounds I'm going to talk about in just a minute or two. When he returned to the UK, he actually did some of the most pioneering early work at Stonehenge in 1901, undertaking some very significant investigations there in advance of these stones being reset up. And this is a lovely picture because for me, it really questions that notion of the permanent monument that we regard Stonehenge as being. These stones have been regularly moved around over the centuries. Most recently, through the 20th century, extensive work was done to stabilize them and to move them about. These, obviously, they've been picked up by artists around the world. Here we've got a representation by the Japanese woodblock artist Urushibara Yoshiji. This is one of his series of Stonehenge by moonlight at the British Museum. And we'll be focusing in on him for our planned exhibition, which we're hoping, depending on how things go with current circumstances, will be opening in September, but then run for a year. So we very much hope that you'll have the opportunity to come and see that at the Stonehenge World Heritage Visitor Centre, introducing some of our Japanese sites at this iconic site. So Stonehenge, huge permanent monuments, brings me on to the next set of things that I wanted to discuss in terms of Japan, which are the huge burial mounds that were constructed in Japan between the 3rd and the beginning of the 8th century AD. And I was thinking again about this notion of impermanence. And these obviously are massive monuments it's been calculated, they take many tens, if not hundreds of person hours to construct, to plan, to build their projects on a scale that really hadn't been undertaken in the Japanese landscape before. And what are they? They're burial monuments. They're monuments to the early rulers of the first Japanese state. And I regarded this as resisting impermanence. This is rulers resisting the very notion that they might be forgotten about once they had died. Some of the largest of these tombs represent the largest burial mounds, the largest tombs from the ancient world. And here at the Mozu tomb cluster in southern Osaka prefecture in the city of Sakai, we have one of the largest. On the left-hand side here, we've got a reconstruction of what the tomb called the Daisen tomb, or the tomb attributed to the 5th century Emperor Nintoku, the largest of over 160,000 mounded tombs that were built in those 4 centuries of what we call the Kofun period, or the Old Tomb period. 486 meters long. It's larger than the Great Pyramid of Cheops. It's larger than the tomb of the first emperor of China. And unsurprisingly, these tombs have also been put forward for World Heritage status, and indeed were granted that just last year in 2019, when the Mozu Furuichi tomb clusters, 49 of these large keyhole-shaped tombs were inscribed as part of this. And this is, again, takes us back to our theme of impermanence. These are regarded as, these are the final resting places of imperial ancestors of the current day imperial family of Japan, and are part of the material backup, if you like, for the argument that the current Japanese imperial family is the longest surviving royal family anywhere in the world, stretching back over 1,600 years. Now, while these tombs were being built at the later stages of the tomb construction, this region, the Asuka region in southern Nara in central Japan, became the capital area. It became the focus of the first Japanese state. It was the homeland of the Yamato clan, who are indeed the emperors of Japan today as well. Here's a view looking out from the north across the Nara Basin. The modern day city of Nara is up in the blue haze to the north. And what we have here is the early capital area known today as Asuka. Itself the focus of a World Heritage bid. And indeed, I saw in the Japanese newspapers just this morning that it is a bid that's been on the back burner for some considerable time, and there's work going on now to try and revitalize that. The Asuka region is home to a bewildering array of wonderful sites and monuments, and I don't have time to talk about many of these, but I do just want to think about how some of these tombs might, and some of these sites might make us think about that notion of impermanence and that awareness of the passing of time, if you like. Now, at this time, Japanese rulers, the early Japanese emperors, moved their capital on a fairly regular basis around a fairly limited area. And what we have here on the left-hand side of the screen are a series of early palace sites. And on the right-hand side, you can see the excavations of these palaces. Ohara no Miya, only occupied for about 25 years. Kiyomiya no Miya, again, occupied for just over 2 decades. These are short-lived capital sites, if you like, albeit within one area. There's something here about that notion of the passing of time. Here we have a computer reconstruction of the Asuka capital as these areas started to consolidate, and we start to see some new styles of architecture coming in, introduced from China, very much happening all through the 6th and into the 7th century. The site that I want to focus on here, though, was excavated in 1973, and it's a site called Takamatsuzuka. It's a little tiny tomb. It's only about 15 meters in diameter, much smaller than any of those massive tombs that we saw in the Mozu Furuichi Kofun group, for example. Now, Takamatsuzuka, when it was investigated, when it was excavated in 1973, caused an absolute sensation. And that's because inside the tomb were found a series of wall paintings on plaster representing courtiers in dress that looked very similar to some of the Korean kingdoms, in particular the North Korean kingdom of Koguryo. But also on the ceiling of the tomb, sorry, it's a rather strange photograph, but it's with imagine you're looking at a fisheye lens at this small stone burial chamber, which would have held a lacquered coffin with some swords and some trappings for the original incumbent. On the ceiling, there's a star chart picked out, and we'll have a closer look at that in a second. But let's just have a look at what these people were wearing. And associated with these, we have the 4 directional deities. We have the white tiger of the west, we have the azure dragon of the east, we've got the black tortoise serpent of the north, and the vermilion phoenix of the south. And then on the ceiling, we've got this star chart. And just down the road at the Kitora Kofun, there is something very similar. You can see the constellations are picked out in gold foil on this plastered ceiling, and it's possible to locate where that star chart was modeled from, and we think that it was from China, from North China, sometime in the 6th, early 7th century AD. This is the outside of the tomb, and here is the little stone that shows you the constellations as they've been reconstructed and how they relate then to those directional and other deities associated with the cosmological movement of time and that structure of the universe, which would have allowed the elite people who were buried in tombs like Takamatsuzuka. And we think that at Takamatsuzuka, it was possibly one of the sons of the Emperor Tenmu was buried there, or possibly the sons of one of the Korean kingdoms was buried there as well. There's a lot of debate about precisely who it was, but we know it was a high-class person in there and taking with them those images of a universe that would have seen them through eternity at a time when Buddhism was also being introduced into Japan. Now, Takamatsuzuka, unfortunately, and its wall paintings, rather similar to the Paleolithic cave paintings of Lascaux in the Dordogne in France, have really suffered terrible depredations as a result of too many people going in there and admiring them. And it brings me to this topic of the notion of conservation and what as archaeologists we're doing to try and battle this impermanence and to try and stop the passing of time or the ravages of the passing of time in its tracks. And here we have, in 2002, the entirety of the Takamatsuzuka tomb being lifted away and is now in a special conservation facility being run by the Nara National Institute for Cultural Properties in Nara. Again, a very interesting twist, I feel, on this notion of archaeology and the heritage, if you like, of impermanence. I couldn't resist putting this in. This is the Dunhuang star map, which is in the British Library, because for me, this is also a 6th century map of the heavens, which is on paper. Part of a map-making tradition. Beneath that, the two pictures that we have at the bottom are a Han Dynasty map and a map from Qin Dynasty China. So this is the first few centuries BC and the first few centuries AD. So making these charts was something that was an observing the spatial extent of these realms, as well as the cosmological extent of these realms, was all part of taking control of space and time. This again is materialized through monuments such as this, the Chomsongdai Observatory in Gyeongju, the capital of Kumsong, the golden capital of the kingdom of Shilla in Korea, built by Queen Sondok in the 7th century AD. We know from written records that there was a similar observatory built in the Asuka capital, and there are also similar observatory built in 8th century China. So we know that these early elites are finding new technologies to control, if you like, the passing of time and to be able to observe that and to be able to record it in great detail. The construction of the next capital in Japan, just up the road from the Asuka capitals that we've already seen, at Fujiwara, which was the capital and palace between 694 and 710 AD, says to me something about the intention of defeating impermanence. But again, intriguingly, this capital, a huge area, 5 square kilometers, we now think from recent archaeological investigations, only occupied for about 15 years. So the intention of overcoming that impermanence of royal residences was very much thwarted in reality. At Asuka, the control of time is perhaps best exemplified through the Mizochi water clock, where we know that the hours could be carefully recorded through the regular flow of water tied in with the regular ringing of bells. And the control of time, the control of space, all comes together with the creation of an even larger capital at Heijo, modern-day Nara, in 710 AD, when the whole of the imperial rulership and their bureaucracy move up to what is now the Nara area, the north end of the Nara Basin. And here, I'm very struck by, this is a site, it's a huge site. It's 6 kilometers northwest by 5 kilometers north-south, sorry. A much larger area than is occupied by the Fujiwara Palace. But for many years, after it was abandoned, after the capital moved on to what is now the Heian Kyo, or what is now Kyoto, at the end of the 8th century, it really then just languished beneath fields until it was rediscovered in the 1930s. But if you go there today, you have this tremendous sense of the recreation of these illusions of permanency. And this is the reconstruction of the Daigokuden, just one of a number of massive engineering projects which is happening today to bring back the Nara capital and to bring back a sense of what it must have really been like although it was only actually occupied for less than a century, and there were a huge amount of rebuilding and change that happened all through that time. So like our stone circles back in the Jōmon period, although they appear to be monuments with a permanent look to them, actually there's so much change happening within their histories that they very much are about impermanency as well. Just a couple of shots showing you the scale of the excavations going on there. Large-scale state bureaucracies needed records, and the mokan that were discovered at Prince Nagaya's residence from the 8th century in Nara, today, perhaps rather ironically, part of a big shopping mall, this is about impermanent records. These are wooden tallies on which details of various commodities which have come from all around Japan are recorded. And I think perhaps the bureaucrats who would have been responsible for writing these records might have been amused to discover the range of commodities that is now today to be discovered in the Nara family shopping mall that sits atop of the Prince Nagaya site. What they would have thought about the passing of time in that way can only be speculated upon. But what is interesting here is we're seeing for the first time bureaucrats making very controlled records of what is coming through, but then just throwing these records away. So these objects, most of these mokan are thrown away in pits, and they've survived through waterlogging. That is very different to the writing of the first histories in Japan, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, beginning of the 8th century, written while Nara is the capital. And I describe this as transcending impermanence, or at least the attempt to transcend impermanence, not only controlling space and time, but also controlling history. And these two volumes, perhaps some of the most successful attempts at that we've seen in history anywhere, these were the authorized histories of Japan till 1945. That brings us to just in closing, to the great monuments of Nara, which themselves are now inscribed as World Heritage. The great Todaiji Temple and the Daibutsu within. What are stronger images of permanence and the permanence of power, both cosmic and earthly. And yet we know that this building, although it is still the world's largest wooden building, has been destroyed in the past and rebuilt. So even these monuments have got incredible stories that remind us of the impermanence of most human endeavors. And here's just one example. We know that the Todaiji Temple originally is recorded as having 200-meter tall pagodas on either side. And here are excavations recent years in the close to Todaiji Temple picking up the base of one of those pagodas. The Shosoin is perhaps another very poignant example of this attempt to overcome impermanency. We know the huge treasures, over 9,000 artifacts kept in the imperial repository, built by the Emperor Jōmon and his Empress Komyo in the middle part of the 8th century AD, full of treasures from the Silk Roads as well as from Japan, bringing, if you like, the world to the Nara capital. I'm now going to give you a little bit of an advert break, because next year, the other project, which as well as the Jomon project for this year, next year we have a project looking at the ways in which the Silk Roads, which the eastern terminus of which is the Shosoin, link up across Eurasia and in fact bring us much further west than we might be expecting, as well as from their eastern terminus in the Shosoin. And at the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts at my own university, where we have some rather wonderful Japanese artworks that I very much hope one day you'll be able to come visit, we have this rather splendid small bodhisattva head, which we're going to be setting at the heart of our exhibition. So, excuse the advert break. I just want to assure you that there are plenty of places, I'm running out of time here, that you can find out more information about what I've been talking about online. We're creating a number of online digital facilities to bring the wonders of Japanese archaeology to a much wider audience. We're putting out publications like this that we hope will also engage much more widely. There are many thousands of Japanese archaeologists. Very few of them, sadly, write or read in English. And we're doing our best through the Sainsbury Institute and through the various partnerships that we have across Japan and around the world to make sure that we open this wonderful world up to wider audiences as best we can. We'll be doing that partly through some structured courses at the University of East Anglia from this autumn. And that really brings me to the end of my talk, and just to sort of to wrap up thinking about the ways in which we can use these material traces of the past, the things that archaeologists work so much with, to question this notion of impermanency and think about how people in the past, whether the very distant past or these early elite societies in Nara period Japan, were aware of the passing of time, aware of their own impermanence, and aware of what it was they could possibly do about it. So thank you very much indeed for your attention, and do keep on washing those hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Simon Kainer, for that wonderful lecture. And we do still have minutes left for questions. And so I'd like to encourage those of you who do have questions to send them in. Let me just start. I have one to begin with. This question is, do these ancient Japanese site, I'm assuming this is referring to the stone circles, have the same attraction for contemporary Japanese New Age groups as does Stonehenge in England?
That's a really neat question. And I think what you need to do is come and see the amazing exhibition on what we're calling Arts of Jōmon, where there's a whole range of contemporary Japanese artists. And yeah, I think one could very much include them in the rubric of New Ages. Something I think that's with the New Age people who are related to Stonehenge, very often there's quite a strong spiritual side of what they're doing. Whether they're pagans or whether they're just people who feel drawn to those stones because of their age. I think one could see a similar kind of phenomenon in Japan, perhaps in slightly different ways. There's something about the nature of the materials that they're finding. So for example, you'll often find on excavations, if graves are being excavated, people will have gone and left flowers at the graves for them because they're somebody's ancestors. So there is a sort of a spirituality to that. There's the whole thing in Japan around power spots that you may be aware of, and it's a rather wonderful thing. I remember going and seeing the Ise Grand Shrine when it was going through the last round of Tekuni Shinju, and lots of people standing there. There's some amazing archaeology at that place, but standing there just sort of hovering over these old clusters of stones and things, absorbing something. I wish I knew what it was they were absorbing, but there's clearly power there, and people feel drawn to those very ancient places. Maybe because some of the more established religions aren't answering the questions, aren't answering the needs that they have these days. But yeah, I think there's work to be done to sort of understand how that comparison might work.
Okay, and another question here. When you were speaking about the late Jomon period, and you were talking about some of the serving vessels for food, or that we know that they were making vessels for serving food. There was a very striking image of a teapot that you shared, or what seems like a teapot, looked very much like today's teapot. Could you talk a little bit about what you think that might have been used for, and could you give a better sense of what the range of these serving vessels encompasses?
That teapot, isn't that great? Unfortunately, there's no evidence of tea drinking in Japan that early on. It doesn't come until many centuries after that. But we do have a big range of spouted vessels, which were clearly very important in Jomon households and in Jomon ceremonial activities. The pouring of liquids was clearly something that was very significant. We also find little tiny, maybe not tea, but we do find little tiny miniature cups as well, which are little, just like the little chocolate that you might drink a nice cup of sake from today. Really interestingly, at the site called Sannai Mariama, which I mentioned, which is one of the big Jōmon, it's a little earlier than these sites. They found a huge pile of elderberry seeds, interestingly, which seemed to have fermented before they had really become part of the archaeological record. And they knew that they'd been fermenting because they found traces of fruit flies in there. And this is taken as possible evidence for the brewing of alcoholic beverages by these hunter-gatherers. We know they were probably interested in what we might describe as what sort of mind-altering substances, I suppose, whether alcoholic or whether they're plant-based materials that they're experimenting with as well. And so I think we need to sort of see vessels like that teapot, and as I say, not a teapot, but certainly a pouring vessel of some sort in that context. Is that people, those Jōmon people really knew the properties of the foodstuffs and the drinks, the beverages that they were making and procuring, and they would have been fully aware of what they were, and they would have been reflecting that, I think, in those elaborate vessels that they were making to serve things with.
And another question, is there a relationship between the locations of Motus and stone circle sites? Do these follow some sort of human migration?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. Most of the work that's been done on the location of these sites, and I didn't really talk very much about this, there really wasn't much of a chance. I showed that one book cover called Jōmon Landscapes by Kobayashi Tatsuo, and he's been doing a lot of work trying to understand the relationship between those stone circles and nearby topographic features, whether that's mountain peaks, things like that, and then in particular alignments with things like the midsummer and midwinter solstices, sunsets and sunrises at those solstices, and there do seem to be lines of alignment there. So that's one possibility about why these sites are located where they are. We know that certainly in the later part of the Jōmon period, when these monuments are being built, there is, you get much more standardized pottery styles across large swathes of the Japanese archipelago. For example, these guys, what we call these Kamigaoka style pots and figurines like this crop up over quite wide areas of Japan. And that suggests that what you've got are widespread social networks, people in contact with each other. Now, to what extent those people are moving around, I think we don't quite know at the moment. There's been some really interesting work done recently at Stonehenge and sites in the UK, looking at some of the isotopes in the human body, things like trace elements, things like strontium, that allow us to say that people grew up in one place and then ended up living somewhere else. That is still work to be done largely in Japan, but it'd be really interesting if it's possible to do that.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. I have one here from someone who says that they had seen a lecture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art about the ancient flame pots and wondered if any were found at the stone circles.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question. What with my colleague, I have a dear colleague, Miao Toru, who's at the Niigata Prefectural Museum of History. Now, that's the part of Japan, the central part of Honshu, which is where the flame pots come from a relatively restricted area along what is called the Shinano River, which is flows out into the Sea of Japan through the Niigata Plain. He thinks that we may have the origins of the stone circles, those kind of stone-built structures in that part of Japan. And that's a really interesting hypothesis. It's one that we can't prove just yet, but he's on that. And that you do get stone-built features on some of those sites that suggest that you may have some connection there. But there's work to be done. There aren't any very clear, very obvious stone circles as such in that area, but it could be that the idea of building those kind of stone monuments is originating there and then potentially moving further north.
And then one quick question from me. I was curious about the the gold foils used in the star chart at Takamatsuzuka in the wall paintings. And to your knowledge, either in Korea or in Japan, is there use of gold foil on star charts?
Now, there are star charts from some of the Korean tombs, which are a little similar. And of course, what you do get is a whole tradition of gilt bronze, and a lot of the material, a lot of the elite material culture that's coming out from some of these tombs is gold. So I'm thinking of the big tombs, for example, in Gyeongju, where there's the gold crowns, there's all that whole gold regalia. So yeah, the use of metals, the use of gold, I think in that way is something which is very much part of that very elite culture happening there.
Fantastic. Well, let me just thank you one more time, not only for your fabulous lecture, but your very excellent props, which were an unexpected and very much appreciated addition. And to our audience, please check online for the date of our final lecture in this series by Professor Melissa McCormick, Tattered Fans and Talismans. Thank you again, Dr. Kainer. And thanks to our audience. Thanks for joining Asia Society. Be well, be safe. We're in this together. Good night.